Airport employees humiliated and kicked Sasha Obama out. But everything changed when her father showed up. Subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The sun had barely risen over Washington, D.C., painting the early morning sky in hues of orange and pink. Sasha Obama, 21 years old and determined to carve out her identity apart from her famous family, adjusted her backpack and glanced at the time on her phone. It was just past 6:30 a.m., and she was on her way to catch a flight to New York City. She had been invited to present her research at a prestigious youth conference, a chance to share her voice and ideas with other bright young minds. She felt a mix of excitement and nerves, her thoughts swirling with rehearsed lines and potential questions from the audience. Her father had given her a pep talk the night before, his words still echoing in her mind. "Remember, you're there because of your work, your dedication. Nobody can take that from you." She appreciated his support, but it was hard not to feel the weight of her last name wherever she went. As she stepped into the bustling terminal at Reagan National Airport, the noise and chaos of early morning travelers hit her like a wave. Announcements echoed overhead, interspersed with the hum of voices and the click of suitcases rolling across tiled floors. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted from nearby kiosks, mingling with the faint scent of jet fuel that lingered in the air. Sasha navigated the crowded space, her slender frame allowing her to slip through clusters of travelers. She approached the check-in counter, clutching her ticket and ID. The woman behind the desk barely looked up as Sasha placed her documents on the counter. "Good morning," Sasha said, her tone polite but brisk. The woman, wearing a name tag that read M. Reynolds, finally glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she scanned Sasha's face and then her documents. "Flying to New York?" Reynolds asked, her tone neutral but clipped. "Yes," Sasha replied. "Business class?" Reynolds raised an eyebrow and held the ticket up as if inspecting it for counterfeit markers. Her pause stretched a beat too long, the air between them growing taut. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" Reynolds asked, her voice tinged with incredulity. Sasha blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Yes, of course. Is there a problem?" Reynolds pressed her lips into a thin line as she scanned the ticket again, then flipped through her computer screen. "We don't usually see passengers like—" She stopped mid-sentence, her face tightening as if realizing she had said too much. "Never mind, just making sure everything's in order." Sasha felt a flicker of irritation but brushed it off. She wasn't about to let a rude employee ruin her morning. However, when Reynolds called over another agent, whispering something while pointing in Sasha's direction, that flicker ignited into a small flame of anger. The second agent, a man with a stern expression, approached and scrutinized Sasha's ID with exaggerated care. "This ticket is for business class," he said, his tone laden with suspicion. "I know," Sasha replied, her voice steady but firm. "It's my ticket." The man exchanged a look with Reynolds, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine, go ahead," he muttered, waving her through with a dismissive gesture. Sasha grabbed her ticket and ID, her jaw clenched as she moved toward the security checkpoint. She could feel eyes on her, passengers glancing at her curiously but saying nothing. Her father's advice echoed in her mind. "Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are." She took a deep breath, steadying herself for the next step. The line at security was long but orderly. TSA agents barked instructions and travelers shuffled forward in small bursts. Sasha placed her backpack on the conveyor belt and stepped through the metal detector without incident. As she reached for her bag on the other side, a TSA agent blocked her path. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "We need to perform a secondary screening." Sasha frowned, glancing at the conveyor belt where her bag sat untouched. "Why? Is there a problem?" "It's just a random check," the agent said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He gestured toward a separate area cordoned off by retractable barriers. "This way, please." Sasha complied, though her frustration was mounting. The random check involved an invasive pat-down, a thorough rummaging through her bag, and repeated questions about the purpose of her trip. "Who bought your ticket?" the agent asked, holding up her boarding pass. "I did," Sasha replied, her voice clipped. It's for a conference. The agent smirked. Pretty fancy conference if you're flying business class. Sasha's face flushed with indignation, but she bit her tongue. She knew better than to escalate the situation. When the agent finally finished, he handed back her belongings with a perfunctory, "You're good to go." Sasha returned to the main terminal, her composure shaken but intact. She checked her watch and realized she had less than an hour before her flight. Picking up her pace, she headed toward her gate, determined not to let the morning's events distract her. Checkpoint. She could feel eyes on her, passengers glancing at her curiously but saying nothing. Her father's advice echoed in her mind. Don't let anyone make you feel less than you are. She took a deep breath, steadying herself for the next step. The line at security was long but orderly. TSA agents barked instructions and travelers shuffled forward in small bursts. Sasha placed her backpack on the conveyor belt and stepped through the metal detector without incident. As she reached for her bag on the other side, a TSA agent blocked her path. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "We need to perform a secondary screening." Sasha frowned, glancing at the conveyor belt where her bag sat untouched. "Why? Is there a problem?" "It's just a random check," the agent said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He gestured toward a separate area cordoned off by retractable barriers. "This way, please." Sasha complied, though her frustration was mounting. The random check involved an invasive pat-down, a thorough rummaging through her bag, and repeated questions about the purpose of her trip. "Who bought your ticket?" the agent asked, holding up her boarding pass. "I did," Sasha replied, her voice clipped. "It's for a conference." The agent smirked. "Pretty fancy conference if you're flying business class." Sasha's face flushed with indignation, but she bit her tongue. She knew better than to escalate the situation. When the agent finally finished, he handed back her belongings with a perfunctory, "You're good to go." Sasha returned to the main terminal, her composure shaken but intact. She checked her watch and realized she had less than an hour before her flight. Picking up her pace, she headed toward her gate, determined not to let the morning's events distract her. But as she neared the gate, she saw a cluster of airline staff whispering and pointing in her direction. One of them, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached her. "Miss, I need to see your ticket and ID again," the woman said, her tone devoid of courtesy. Sasha handed over her documents, her patience wearing thin. The woman inspected them, then said, "We've been informed there may be an issue with your ticket. Please, come with me." "What kind of issue?" Sasha demanded, her voice rising. "Date routine verification," the woman replied, already walking toward a side corridor. "This way." Sasha hesitated, her instincts telling her something was off, but she followed, her heart pounding. As she entered the corridor and realized it led away from the gate area, the woman stopped abruptly and turned to face her. "I'm sorry, but we can't allow you to board this flight," she said, her tone cold and final. "You'll need to leave the airport." Sasha stared at her, stunned. "What? Why?" The woman shrugged. "We have our reasons." Fury surged through Sasha. "This is unacceptable. I've done nothing wrong." The woman crossed her arms. "If you don't leave willingly, we'll have security escort you out." Sasha clenched her fists, her mind racing. She could feel the humiliation rising, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. But she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Breaking, she pulled out her phone and called the one person she knew would make things right. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling, "I need you." The call ended with a calm, steady reply from the other end. "I'm on my way." But for Sasha Obama, those words weren't enough to quell the storm brewing inside her. Standing in the shadow of the bustling Reagan National Airport, her mind reeled with the events of the past half hour. The humiliation of being treated as though she didn't belong had seeped into her, and now, with her flight set to leave in less than 45 minutes, she was stranded. The corridor where she had been pulled aside was eerily quiet compared to the chaos of the terminal. The woman who had led her there had returned to the main gate area, leaving Sasha standing alone near a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." She clutched her bag tightly, her fingers trembling as adrenaline coursed through her veins. Her instincts told her to leave this spot, to step back into the light of the terminal where at least there were witnesses. But she hesitated, unsure of what might happen if she moved. Her phone buzzed in her hand, a text from her father. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Stay where you are." Sasha exhaled shakily. The assurance helped steady her nerves, but the sting of indignation remained fresh. Why had she been singled out? She replayed the morning's events in her head. The faces of the TSA agents, the airline staff, the whispers and pointed fingers. It wasn't hard to see the pattern. She had grown up recognizing the quiet, insidious ways people let their prejudices slip into their actions. But this was different. This was blatant. As her thoughts spiraled, the sound of approaching footsteps jolted her. 2 TSA agents appeared, one male and one female, both with stiff postures and stern expressions. The man held a clipboard, his grip tight as if it were a shield, while the woman carried a handheld scanner. "Ma'am, we need to conduct an additional screening," the man said, his tone clipped and devoid of empathy. "Please place your bag on the table." Sasha's jaw tightened. "I've already been screened twice," she replied, her voice firm but not raised. She had learned from her parents the power of composure even in the face of blatant injustice. The woman's expression didn't waver. "This is a random check, ma'am. Compliance is mandatory." Sasha stared at them for a moment, then reluctantly placed her bag on the table. She watched as they unzipped it and began rummaging through her belongings with little regard for their order. They pulled out her laptop, flipping it open as though searching for hidden compartments. Her toiletries bag was dumped out, the contents spilling onto the table in a messy heap. "Is this really necessary?" Sasha asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to remain calm. The male agent ignored her question, holding up a book she had packed. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone almost accusatory. "It's a book for the conference I'm attending," Sasha replied, her patience thinning. He squinted at the cover as if it were written in an alien language, then tossed it aside. The woman ran the handheld scanner over her laptop, her movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the power she held in this moment. Sasha glanced around, hoping to catch the eye of someone who might intervene, but the corridor was still deserted. Her isolation made the situation feel even more oppressive. "How long?" After several minutes of invasive inspection, the agent stepped back. "We'll need to hold on to your bag for further analysis," the man said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "What? No," Sasha protested, stepping forward instinctively. "You can't just take my things. I have a flight to catch." The woman's gaze hardened. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to escalate this matter." "Escalate," Sasha repeated, her voice rising despite herself. "You've already humiliated me in front of everyone at security, and now you're trying to steal my things? This is harassment." Her words echoed in the empty corridor. The agents exchanged a look, their expressions unreadable, before the man stepped forward. "You need to calm down," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "We're just doing our job." Sasha took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She knew she couldn't let her emotions take control, not here, not now. "I'm not going anywhere without my bag," she said, her voice quieter but no less firm. The male agent opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a new figure appeared at the end of the corridor. It was the manager who had confronted her earlier, flanked by 2 security guards. Their presence made the already suffocating space feel even smaller. "What's going on here?" the manager demanded, her sharp voice cutting through the tension. The female agent straightened. "We're conducting a secondary screening. She's refusing to comply." "That's not true," Sasha interjected, her frustration boiling over. "I've complied with everything you've asked, and now they're trying to take my bag for no reason." The manager's eyes narrowed as she looked Sasha up and down. "This is becoming a disruption, miss. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the airport." The words hit Sasha like a slap. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've done nothing wrong." The manager's expression didn't soften. We have the right to deny service to anyone who poses a potential security risk." "A security risk?" Sasha repeated, incredulous. "You're calling me a security risk because you don't like how I look?" The silence that followed was deafening. The guards stepped forward, their postures menacing. Sasha felt her chest tighten, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. This couldn't be happening. "I'm calling my father," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. She pulled out her phone, her hand shaking as she dialed the number. The manager's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing as Sasha raised the phone to her ear. The call connected almost instantly. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling, "I need you. They're kicking me out of the airport." Her father's voice was calm but firm. "Stay where you are. I'll handle it." As the call ended, Sasha turned back to the agents and the manager. "My father is on his way," she said, her tone carrying a weight of authority that belied her youth. "I suggest you think very carefully about what you do next." The manager hesitated, her confidence wavering for the first time. But before she could respond, the male agent shifted uncomfortably, stealing a glance at his colleagues. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of their actions pressing heavily upon them. Sasha stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. Every second felt like an eternity as she waited. Would they double down on their actions, or would they finally recognize the gravity of the situation? The answer lay in the moments ahead, as the sound of approaching footsteps signaled that change was imminent. The agent muttered under his breath, loud enough for Sasha to hear, "Daddy's coming to save the day, huh?" Sasha's jaw tightened, but she refused to rise to the bait. Instead, she stepped back, leaning against the wall as she waited. She could feel the stares of the guards and agents on her, their judgment heavy in the air, but she refused to let them see her break. Somewhere beyond the corridor, the noise of the terminal continued unabated. Announcements blared. Passengers hurried to their gates, and the world moved on as if nothing had happened. But for Sasha, time seemed to stand still, each second stretching into an eternity. Then, finally, the sound of approaching footsteps reached her ears. Footsteps that carried a familiar rhythm, a calm assurance. Relief washed over her as she looked up to see her father striding toward her, his expression a mask of composed determination. The sound of Barack Obama's approaching footsteps filled the narrow corridor like the low rumble of distant thunder. His presence was magnetic, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. The security guards straightened instinctively, their expressions shifting from detached indifference to wary focus. The manager, standing at the forefront of the small group confronting Sasha, stiffened momentarily before adjusting her posture, an uneasy smile flickering across her lips. Sasha stepped away from the wall, her relief palpable. She had always admired her father's ability to remain composed under pressure, and in this moment his calm authority felt like a shield against the storm of humiliation and frustration that had been battering her since she arrived at the airport. "Miss Obama," he said, his voice measured as though he hadn't noticed the tension in the air. "Are you all right?" Sasha nodded, though her voice caught as she tried to reply. They were going to kick me out of the airport." Barack's gaze shifted to the manager, his expression unreadable but heavy with expectation. "Is that true?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. The manager hesitated, glancing at the TSA agents as if searching for support. "Sir," she began, her voice tinged with defensive irritation. "We had concerns regarding her behavior. She was becoming disruptive, and we have protocols in place for situations like this." "Disruptive?" Barack repeated, raising an eyebrow. His calm exterior didn't waver, but there was a subtle sharpness in his tone. "Can you explain exactly how my daughter was being disruptive?" The manager opened her mouth to respond, but the male TSA agent interrupted, his voice brimming with misplaced confidence. "You refused to comply with our security procedures. We were just trying to do our job." "That's not true," Sasha interjected, her voice trembling with anger. "I complied with everything you asked. You treated me like a criminal for no reason, and when I pushed back against the harassment, you decided to call it disruption." The male agent's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. The manager, meanwhile, seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of Sasha's words. Barack's gaze swept over the group, his expression hardening. "It seems to me that there's been a serious misunderstanding," he said, his voice steady but carrying undeniable authority. "Let's address this properly. First, my daughter is not leaving this airport unless she decides to. Second, I'd like a detailed explanation of why she was singled out in the first place." The manager cleared her throat, clearly struggling to maintain control of the situation. "Sir, as I said, we have protocols. Her ticket was flagged and we followed up accordingly." "Flagged for what?" Barack asked, his tone now edged with impatience. "She had a valid ticket, valid ID, and was prepared to board her flight. What exactly prompted this additional screening?" The manager hesitated again, her confidence faltering. The TSA agents avoided eye contact. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. Sasha stood firm, emboldened by her father's presence. Barack folded his arms. "If there was no legitimate reason, then this looks like targeted harassment, and I assure you, I will not let it go unanswered." The weight of his words hung in the air. The manager took a breath, her gaze flickering between Barack and the agents. "Let me check with my supervisor," she finally said, stepping away hurriedly. Sasha exhaled, some of the tension in her chest easing. But she knew the fight wasn't over. She turned to her father, his expression as steady as ever. "We're not done here," he said quietly, his voice firm with resolve. "But you're not alone in this." Sasha nodded. Whatever happened next, she knew her father would stand by her side, and this injustice would not be ignored. "Scrutiny," the woman faltered, her face reddening. The male TSA agent, however, crossed his arms and spoke again. "Sometimes we have to make judgment calls, especially when something doesn't feel right." "Something didn't feel right," Barack repeated, his voice dropping slightly. The weight of his words seemed to press down on the room. "You made a judgment call based on how my daughter looks, didn't you?" The tension in the corridor was almost suffocating. The female TSA agent glanced nervously at her colleague, who avoided her gaze. "I assure you, sir," the manager began, her voice shaking slightly, "we don't tolerate discrimination in this airport." "That's an admirable policy," Barack said, his voice cool, "but actions speak louder than policies. From where I'm standing, this entire situation reeks of bias. My daughter is standing here humiliated and distressed because your team decided she didn't belong in business class. Am I wrong?" No one answered. The silence was deafening, a tacit admission of guilt. Barack exhaled slowly, the sound heavy with disappointment. He turned to Sasha, his expression softening slightly. "Are you ready to go?" he asked gently. Sasha nodded, clutching her bag tightly. She was ready to leave this nightmare behind her, but a part of her bristled at the idea of letting these people off the hook. As they turned to leave, the manager stammered, "Wait, sir, perhaps we can discuss this further." Barack paused, his back to the group. When he spoke, his voice was low and steady, but the warning in his tone was unmistakable. "You'll be hearing from me, and I suggest you prepare yourselves for a thorough review of your so-called protocols." Without another word, he placed a hand on Sasha's shoulder and guided her back toward the main terminal. The corridor behind them remained unnervingly quiet, the weight of their departure hanging heavy in the air. As they walked, Sasha felt a mixture of relief and lingering frustration. She glanced at her father, searching his face for some sign of his true emotions, but his expression remained calm, his focus fixed straight ahead. "Dad," she began hesitantly, "I'm sorry you had to come down here. I didn't know what else to do." Barack stopped and turned to face her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Sasha, you don't have to apologize for standing up for yourself. What happened here today is unacceptable, and it's not your fault. You did the right thing by calling me." His words soothed some of the tension that had been coiled in her chest, but the sting of the morning's events still lingered. "They treated me like I didn't belong," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I know," Barack replied, his tone heavy with a mixture of anger and sadness. "And they're going to answer for it." As Barack Obama and his daughter walked back toward the main terminal, the buzz of airport life gradually filled the silence between them. The announcements, hurried footsteps, and the low murmur of conversation seemed jarring after the tense, stifling quiet of the corridor. Sasha glanced at her father. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions churning within her. She knew him well enough to recognize the sharpness in his otherwise measured stride, the kind of quiet fury he rarely allowed to surface. The weight of the morning pressed down on her. Each humiliating moment replayed in her mind, the accusatory questions, the invasive searches, the insinuations that she didn't belong. It was exhausting, yet the presence of her father felt like a steady anchor in the chaos. They stopped near a row of chairs in the terminal, just far enough from the security checkpoint to avoid prying eyes, but close enough for Barack's protective instincts to remain on high alert. Sasha sat down, clutching her bag as if it were a lifeline. Her father remained standing, his eyes scanning the area with an air of calm authority. "Dad," she said, her voice soft but strained, "I don't want this to happen to anyone else." Her words hung in the air for a moment before Barack nodded. "It won't," he said firmly. "We'll make sure of that." Just then, a uniformed airline representative approached them, her face a mixture of unease and professional composure. She was flanked by two more staff members, their body language stiff and uncomfortable. The lead representative, a woman whose name tag read M. Patel, cleared her throat. "Mr. Obama," she began, her tone carefully controlled. "On behalf of the airport and our airline, I want to sincerely apologize for the inconvenience your daughter experienced." Barack turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "Inconvenience?" he repeated, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Is that what you call it?" Patil hesitated, momentarily thrown off balance. "I assure you, sir, we take these matters very seriously. I've been informed of the situation, and I want you to know that we are investigating it thoroughly." Barack's gaze remained steady. "Looking into it isn't enough. I want a full report on what happened here today. I want to know why my daughter was treated like a second-class citizen when she did nothing wrong." Patel nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. We will provide a detailed account. Additionally, the employees involved will be placed under review, and we are evaluating our training protocols to ensure this does not happen again." Sasha watched the exchange, still gripping her bag tightly. She wanted to believe Patel's words meant something, but she knew too well that change only happened when people demanded it. Her father exhaled slowly before speaking again. "I expect to hear from you within the next 48 hours. Do not make me follow up." Patel nodded once more. "You have my word, Mr. Obama." As she and her team hurried away, Sasha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Barack turned back to her, his expression softer now. "Let's get you home," he said gently. Sasha nodded. She wasn't sure how this would all unfold, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't let this be forgotten. A woman with a name tag that read M. Patel addressed Barack directly. "Mr. Obama," she began, her tone carefully controlled. "On behalf of the airport and our airline, I want to apologize for any inconvenience you and your daughter have experienced this morning." Barack turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "Inconvenience?" he repeated, his voice calm but with an edge that made the woman visibly shift on her feet. "Is that what you call it?" Patel hesitated, her composure wavering. "I assure you, we take these matters very seriously. I've been informed of the situation, and I want you to know that we're looking into it." "Looking into it?" Barack echoed, his tone clipped. "Let me be clear, Ms. Patel. My daughter was humiliated, singled out, and treated as though she didn't belong here. That's not an inconvenience. It's discrimination. And if your staff can't tell the difference, then you have a much bigger problem than you realize." Sasha watched the exchange in silence, her emotions a mix of vindication and lingering frustration. Patel's face reddened, and she glanced at her colleagues as if searching for support. "We deeply regret what happened," Patel said, her voice softer now. If there's anything we can do to make this right—" "There is," Barack interrupted. His voice was calm but carried the weight of undeniable authority. "First, I want the names of every TSA agent and staff member involved in this incident. Second, I expect a full report on your so-called protocols that allowed this to happen in the first place. And third, I want you to ensure that this kind of behavior is not only addressed, but eradicated." Patel nodded quickly, pulling a notepad from her pocket. "Of course, Mr. Obama. I'll personally oversee the investigation." "You'll do more than oversee," Barack said. "You'll act. Because if I don't see immediate, concrete changes, I'll make sure this incident is brought to the attention of every major news outlet in the country." The threat, though delivered in a measured tone, sent a visible ripple of unease through the group. Patel scribbled furiously in her notepad, nodding all the while as the representatives scurried away. Barack turned back to Sasha. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. "We're not done here," he said quietly, "but first, let's get you on that flight." The airline's decision to delay the flight for Barack and Sasha caused a stir among the waiting passengers. Whispers spread like wildfire, and several people craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the former president. Sasha, feeling the weight of their stares, kept her gaze down as she followed her father to the gate. The gate agent, a young man with a nervous smile, hurriedly scanned their boarding passes and gestured them through with exaggerated politeness. "Have a great flight, Mr. Obama," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Barack offered a curt nod, his focus unwavering. As they walked down the jet bridge, Sasha couldn't help but release a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time that morning, she felt a glimmer of relief. Once they were seated, Barack turned to her, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked. Sasha nodded, though her voice betrayed her lingering unease. "I'm just tired." Barack placed a hand over hers. "I know, but you did the right thing, Sasha. Standing up for yourself, calling me. That takes courage." Her eyes welled up with unshed tears, but she blinked them away. "It shouldn't have to." "No," Barack agreed, "it shouldn't. But until people stop making assumptions based on someone's appearance, we have to keep pushing back." The flight itself was uneventful, but Sasha's mind remained restless. She stared out the window as the plane ascended, the city shrinking beneath them. The morning's events replayed in her head, a whirlwind of indignation and resolve. She knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had faced similar prejudices, who lacked the platform or the voice to fight back. As the plane leveled, she turned to her father. "Dad, we have to do something about this." Barack studied her for a moment, then nodded. "We will." Sasha couldn't shake the heaviness that had settled over her as she stared out the window, the clouds below them stretching endlessly into the horizon. Her mind replayed the morning's events. She thought about the TSA agents, the manager, the smirking guard, people who had likely never stopped to consider the impact of their actions. Her father's voice interrupted her thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" Sasha turned to him, her expression resolute. "How to make sure this never happens again." Barack smiled faintly, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Good, because this fight isn't just about you or me. It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong." His words lingered with her, filling her with a renewed sense of purpose. By the time they landed in New York, Sasha felt more determined than ever to turn this experience into something meaningful. As they exited the plane, Barack's phone buzzed with a message. He read it quickly, his expression darkening slightly. "What is it?" Sasha asked. He held up the screen for her to see. It was an email from Patel detailing the immediate steps the airline and TSA planned to take. But what caught Sasha's attention was the final line. "We've also placed the agents involved on administrative leave, pending further investigation." It was a start. The email hung in the air between Sasha and Barack as they walked through the terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport. The mention of the TSA agents being placed on administrative leave seemed like a small victory, but it wasn't enough to dispel the weight of what had happened. Barack's jaw tightened as he slid his phone back into his pocket, his mind already working through the next steps. For Sasha, however, the morning's events remained a raw wound. The humiliation, the invasive scrutiny, the dismissive attitudes, each moment lingered in her thoughts like a splinter she couldn't remove. As they exited the airport, the noise of New York City provided little solace. The city's chaos mirrored her internal turmoil. "Dad," Sasha began hesitantly as they slid into the back seat of a waiting car, "do you think anything will actually change? I mean, they suspended those agents, but isn't that just damage control?" Barack turned to her, his gaze steady. "You're right to be skeptical," he said. "Suspensions are a start, but they're not enough. Accountability has to go deeper. The systems that allow this kind of behavior need to be dismantled." Sasha nodded, though her frustration still simmered beneath the surface. "I just don't want this to be swept under the rug." "It won't be," Barack assured her. "We'll make sure of that." As the car navigated through the crowded streets, Barack made a call to his team. His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge of urgency. He outlined the events at Reagan National Airport in precise detail, emphasizing the need for a comprehensive response. By the time they arrived at their destination, he had already set a plan in motion. The story began to unfold in the media the next morning. News outlets picked up on the incident, their headlines stark and accusatory. Sasha Obama, targeted in airport discrimination scandal. Former president demands accountability for TSA misconduct. Bias at the gates, a call for change. Barack's office released a statement later that day outlining the events and calling for immediate reform. The statement was measured, but its implications were clear. This was not an isolated incident, and the Obamas were committed to using their platform to address the systemic issues that allowed such discrimination to persist. The public response was swift and polarized. Supporters flooded social media with messages of solidarity, while critics accused the Obamas of overreacting or using their influence unfairly. Despite the noise, one thing was certain: the incident had struck a nerve. Within days, an internal investigation was launched at Reagan National Airport. The TSA and the airline involved faced intense scrutiny as reports emerged detailing not just Sasha's experience, but similar complaints from other passengers who had been subjected to questionable treatment. Whistleblowers from within the TSA began coming forward, their accounts painting a troubling picture of a workplace culture rife with implicit bias and unchecked authority. The agents involved in Sasha's case were suspended pending the investigation, but their actions had already drawn widespread condemnation. One of the agents, identified in leaked reports as Mark Henson, was particularly vocal in his defense, claiming that his decisions were based on protocol, not prejudice. Barack watched the coverage with a mixture of frustration and resolve. The media scrutiny was necessary, but he knew that real change required more than public outrage. It required systemic reform. He was determined to push forward, ensuring that what happened to Sasha would serve as a catalyst for lasting change. Sasha, too, felt a renewed sense of responsibility. She had been placed in this position not just to endure injustice, but to fight against it, and she wasn't going to let it fade into the background. "Dad," she said as they sat in his office later that evening, "we need to make sure this actually leads to something." Barack looked at her, his expression filled with determination. "We will. And this is just the beginning." Satisfaction and frustration mingled as Barack reflected on the ongoing media attention. While it was necessary to keep the pressure on, he knew that real change required more than public outrage. It required systemic reform. In Washington, Barack met with representatives from the TSA and the Department of Transportation. The meeting was tense from the outset, the room filled with bureaucrats eager to defend their policies. But Barack's reputation and presence commanded respect, and his words left no room for evasion. "This isn't just about my daughter," he began, his tone even but firm. This is about every person who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong because of how they look, where they come from, or what someone assumes about them. The events at Reagan National Airport are a symptom of a much larger problem, and it's a problem we have the power and the responsibility to fix. He outlined a series of proposed reforms, each aimed at addressing the systemic issues within the TSA. The measures included mandatory bias training for all employees, the establishment of an independent oversight committee to handle complaints, and the implementation of clearer protocols to prevent abuse of authority. The officials listened, some nodding in agreement, while others exchanged weary glances. The former professional noticed by the end of the meeting, Barack had secured a commitment to begin implementing the reforms, though he knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with resistance. Meanwhile, the agents who had targeted Sasha faced growing consequences. Public pressure mounted as more details of their behavior came to light. Henson, the agent who had mocked Sasha during the security screening, was particularly vilified. Videos of his past interactions with passengers began circulating online, revealing a pattern of rude and dismissive behavior. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from a fellow TSA employee who anonymously reported that Henson had made disparaging remarks about passengers of color on multiple occasions. The whistleblower's account, combined with the growing mountain of complaints, led to Henson's termination. His colleagues who had been complicit in the incident faced similar fates. The manager who had ordered Sasha's removal from the airport was also dismissed after an internal review found her actions to be unjustified. Her departure was framed as a resignation, but insiders confirmed that she had been pressured to step down. For Sasha, the fallout was bittersweet. She followed the news closely, her emotions a mix of relief and lingering anger. She was glad to see the individuals who had wronged her held accountable, but she knew that their punishments were only a small piece of the puzzle. In the weeks that followed, she began speaking out about her experience, sharing her story in interviews and at events. Her words were candid and powerful, resonating with audiences across the country. She spoke not just about her own ordeal, but about the broader issues of bias and inequality, using her platform to amplify the voices of others who had been silenced. Her father stood by her every step of the way, offering guidance and support, but also encouraging her to find her own voice. "This is your fight too," he told her one evening as they prepared for a televised interview. "You have the power to make a difference, Sasha. Don't be afraid to use it." By the end of the month, the reforms Barack had championed were beginning to take shape. TSA employees across the country underwent mandatory training, and a new hotline for reporting misconduct was established. The Oversight Committee, though still in its early stages, promised greater accountability for the agency. For Sasha, the changes were a step in the right direction, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The experience at Reagan National Airport had been a painful reminder of the work that still needed to be done, but it had also shown her the power of speaking out and the importance of standing up for what was right, even in the face of adversity. The morning sun cast a golden glow over Washington, D.C., as Barack Obama sipped his coffee on the balcony of his family's home. The events of the past weeks had been a whirlwind of media attention, high-stakes meetings, and policy proposals. Yet, as he looked out over the city, a sense of quiet determination settled within him. This wasn't the first time he had fought for systemic change, and it wouldn't be the last. Inside the house, Sasha was preparing for another public appearance. She had been invited to speak at a national conference on social justice and equity, an opportunity to share her story and the lessons she had learned. The thought of standing in front of such a large audience made her stomach churn, but she knew the importance of her voice in this moment. As she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blazer, her father appeared in the doorway. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his tone gentle. Sasha turned to him, a mix of nerves and determination in her eyes. "Nervous," she admitted, "but ready." Barack smiled, stepping into the room. "You've got this," he said. "Just speak from the heart. People need to hear your truth." His words were comforting, but Sasha couldn't shake the weight of responsibility she felt. The incident at Reagan National Airport had been a catalyst for change, but it was also a reminder of the pervasive inequalities that still existed. She was determined to use her platform to push the conversation forward, but the path ahead felt daunting. The conference was held in a grand hall in downtown D.C., its walls lined with banners proclaiming themes of justice, equality, and progress. As Sasha and Barack arrived, they were met with a wave of applause and camera flashes. The attention was overwhelming, but Sasha focused on her father's calm presence beside her, drawing strength from his unwavering support. The audience was a diverse mix of activists, policymakers, students, and community leaders. As Sasha took the stage, the room fell silent, all eyes on her. She took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium for support. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "My name is Sasha Obama, and I'm here today to share a story that, unfortunately, is not unique to me." The room hung on to her every word, and as she spoke, Sasha knew she had stepped into a role far greater than she had imagined. The fight for justice was far from over, but she was ready to carry it forward. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of media attention, high-stakes meetings, and policy proposals. Yet, as he looked out over the city, a sense of quiet determination settled within him. This wasn't the first time he had fought for systemic change, and it wouldn't be the last. Inside the house, Sasha was preparing for another public appearance. She had been invited to speak at a national conference on social justice and equity, an opportunity to share her story and the lessons she had learned. The thought of standing in front of such a large audience made her stomach churn, but she knew the importance of her voice in this moment. As she stood in front of the mirror adjusting her blazer, her father appeared in the doorway. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his tone gentle. Sasha turned to him, a mix of nerves and determination in her eyes. "Nervous," she admitted, "but ready." Barack smiled, stepping into the room. "You've got this," he said. "Just speak from the heart. People need to hear your truth." His words were comforting, but Sasha couldn't shake the weight of responsibility she felt. The incident at Reagan National Airport had been a catalyst for change, but it was also a reminder of the pervasive inequalities that still existed. She was determined to use her platform to push the conversation forward, but the path ahead felt daunting. The conference was held in a grand hall in downtown D.C., its walls lined with banners proclaiming themes of justice, equality, and progress. As Sasha and Barack arrived, they were met with a wave of applause and camera flashes. The attention was overwhelming, but Sasha focused on her father's calm presence beside her, drawing strength from his unwavering support. The audience was a diverse mix of activists, policymakers, students, and community leaders. As Sasha took the stage, the room fell silent, all eyes on her. She took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium for support. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "My name is Sasha Obama, and I'm here today to share a story that unfortunately is not unique to me." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "A few weeks ago, I was traveling to New York for a conference. What should have been a routine trip turned into an experience of humiliation, bias, and discrimination. I was singled out, scrutinized, and ultimately removed from the airport, not because of anything I did, but because of how I was perceived." Her voice grew stronger as she recounted the events in detail, describing the invasive searches, the dismissive attitudes, and the blatant assumptions made about her. She spoke of the pain and frustration she felt, but also of the resilience and determination that had carried her through. "This isn't just about me," she said, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "It's about every person who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. It's about a system that allows prejudice to dictate how people are treated, and it's about the change we must demand together." The room erupted in applause as she finished, her words resonating deeply with those in attendance. As she stepped off the stage, her father met her with a proud smile, his eyes shining with pride. "You were incredible," he said, pulling her into a brief hug. That was exactly what people needed to hear. Sasha felt a surge of relief and pride, but also a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice was far from over, but she knew she had the strength to continue. In the weeks that followed, the reforms championed by Barack began to take root. The mandatory bias training for TSA employees was rolled out nationwide, with sessions designed to challenge stereotypes and promote empathy. The Independent Oversight Committee was established, tasked with investigating complaints and holding TSA employees accountable for their actions. For Sasha, these changes were a step in the right direction, but she knew the work was not yet done. She continued using her platform to speak out against injustice, sharing her experience and encouraging others to demand accountability. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let it be silenced. The fight for change had only just begun, but Sasha was ready to stand on the front lines. Employees were held accountable for their conduct, and the hotline for reporting discrimination became operational, providing passengers with a direct channel for voicing their concerns. The changes were met with mixed reactions. While many praised the efforts as a step toward equity, others resisted, arguing that the measures were unnecessary or burdensome. Barack was no stranger to such opposition, and he remained steadfast in his commitment to the cause. Sasha, too, continued to advocate for change. She used her platform to amplify the voices of others, sharing stories of those who had faced similar injustices. Her speeches, interviews, and social media posts sparked important conversations, inspiring others to speak out and demand accountability. One afternoon, Sasha received an email from a young woman who had been traveling through Reagan National Airport shortly after the incident. The woman described how she had been treated with kindness and respect by the TSA agents, a stark contrast to her previous experiences. "I don't know what changed," the email read, "but I wanted to thank you. Your story made a difference." Sasha read the email twice, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and hope. She forwarded it to her father, who replied with a simple message: "This is why we fight." As the months passed, the ripple effects of the incident continued to spread. Other airports began adopting similar reforms, and advocacy groups pushed for broader changes across the transportation industry. The conversation about bias and discrimination extended beyond the TSA, touching on issues in policing, education, and healthcare. For Sasha, the experience was transformative. It had been painful and humiliating, but it had also been a powerful lesson in resilience and the importance of speaking out. She had found her voice and learned how to use it to create change. One evening, as she and her father sat on the balcony watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think things will ever really change?" she asked. Barack took a sip of his coffee, his gaze steady. "Change is slow," he said, "but every step forward matters. Every voice raised, every injustice challenged. It all adds up. And the fact that you're asking that question, that you care enough to fight for a better future, is a sign that we're moving in the right direction." Sasha nodded, her resolve strengthening. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready to walk it. The story of Sasha Obama's experience at Reagan National Airport became a symbol of the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. It was a reminder of the power of resilience, the importance of accountability, and the potential for change when people stand together. For Sasha, it was the beginning of a journey that would shape her future in ways she had never imagined. The story teaches that confronting discrimination with resilience and calm is essential. Despite facing humiliating and invasive treatment at the airport solely due to prejudice, Sasha maintained her composure and stood up for herself. Her father's timely intervention restored her dignity and triggered accountability measures and policy reforms. This experience shows that every act of courage and self-advocacy can drive systemic change. It reminds us that speaking out against injustice, even when difficult, is necessary to create a fairer society where everyone is treated with respect and equality. Thank you for watching this video. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes. We have many more exciting things to come, so click on the next video for more stories and stay tuned.